All right. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. My name is Savannah. I am the marketing coordinator at Signet, and I will be hosting this, but Sheila Akbar, who is our president and COO, will be presenting how do college admissions officers read your application. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to type all your questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Savannah. I always appreciate your help here. I recognize some names here, and so I'm really happy to see you all joining us. Makes it easier for me to present. I'm not just talking to a bunch of nameless, formless people. I know you're real. I know you probably all have lots of questions, especially with changes to the college admissions process due to COVID. So I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So we'll just dive right in. This webinar today is about how admissions officers actually read and evaluate an application. And the goal here is, of course, to kind of pull back the curtain and help you all understand how to give your students sort of an advantage in this process. What is the most strategic way to approach this, knowing what you know about how they're going to view you or how they're going to evaluate you. So I hope this gives you a really nice overview of both the process and what you should be thinking about as you embark on this journey. I'll say it again, we're always here for questions. I love talking about this. Any of you who've talked to me can attest to that. This is something I spend a lot of my time talking to clients about. So if you have any questions that you don't get answered here, definitely feel free to email me and I'll make sure my email is shared with you all. So let's get started. I'm going to restart my screen share. Savannah, tell me what you see. We good?
We're good.
We're good. Okay, great. So title slide, nothing you need to see here. Great. So the first thing I want to start with is who are admissions officers? And I think the first thing to remember is that they are people. They are complicated, nuanced, flawed, biased, busy people. So keep that in mind because it's very easy for students to think that they are writing for some kind of unknowable audience when they're writing their essays or putting their applications together, or they don't even understand that they're writing to an audience. So if you can really visualize the people that you are trying to speak to, you'll have a much easier time putting this whole thing together. And these people come of two general types when they work in an admissions office. Either they're career admissions officers, they've been there for 5, 10, 15 years sometimes, and they've moved around from college admissions office to college admissions office, and that's their profession. And then the other, it's not half, but the other part of the other type of person that you might see in an admissions office are recent college graduates. They've graduated from that institution and then they go on to work in that admissions office. Some of them may have had a role in the admissions office when they were undergrads. Maybe they were an intern there or it was part of their campus work or something like that. And then they just stayed on and started reading applications and taking on more and more responsibility. Some of those recent college graduates do go off to become career college admissions officers, but a lot of them then, go on to do whatever career or graduate program that they're intending to do. In both of these cases, these two types of people really know what makes their school special and what the students at that school are like, and therefore whether you or your student would really fit in. And that word fit is so key. They're looking for students who fit with the philosophy, the vibe, the culture, the environment on campus. And you can slice and dice that any way you want. There's academic fit, there's social fit, there's cultural fit. If it's a religious school, there may be religious fit. There are a lot of different ways to think about how you fit with a school. And sometimes it's important to think about multiple types of fit. And these admissions officers really understand that at a visceral level. And they're hoping that when they read your application, the qualities that they think their students have, they're going to see that in your application. It's going to be demonstrated in your activity list. You're going to be talking about it in your essays. Your teachers will be commenting on, how curious or proactive or, whatever the qualities are. Your teachers are going to mention that in their recommendations. It should be screaming off the pages in your application. So it's really important then to think about, what is the culture of that school? Who are the people who fit? In what ways do you fit? So that you can really emphasize that in your application. Okay. And just to give you kind of another peek behind the curtain here, and remembering that these are people, most applications nowadays are read digitally with the advent of the Common Application Platform as a website, as opposed to the paper form that I submitted when I went to college. The process is really streamlined. But that also caused the application numbers to go up a lot, because it got a lot easier for people to apply to multiple schools all of a sudden, right? So if you look at trends since like 2008, the number is just exponential, the number of applications that people actually file. And our poor admissions officers are tasked with reading all of these things, and they're reading them on a screen. It might be a tablet, it might be a computer. Very rarely are they printing things out. That would be a colossal waste of paper. And a single admissions officer can read over 1,000 applications in an admission cycle. If you think about the numbers that certain colleges see, just 30,000 applications in a season, and they don't have 100 admissions officers reading these things, right? It's not that big of a pool of people. Sometimes they do bring in outside readers, but there's always someone on the core admissions team who has the voting privilege who will review that application. And in many schools, there are 2 people on that admissions committee who will read every single application. So that's just a huge volume of material for them to go through. And it means that there's a lot of different people and personalities to keep straight. It's very easy for an admissions officer to get you confused with somebody else, that maybe they just read their profile and there was something similar and they can't tell the 2 of you apart. So I bring this up to show you why it's so important to differentiate yourself from, not only other students, but other like stereotypes that people, society sort of may hold about your, this seems very unfair, but about your gender, about your ethnic background, about your religious background, whatever it is. Be really aware of those stereotypes and find ways to transcend them, because of course you're more than a stereotype, right? We just really need them to see that and be able to remember that, because as this slide is really emphasizing, they're reading thousands of applications. And how are you going to stick in their mind, right? That's why it's so important to remember your audience, right? And remember that you are trying to show them who you authentically are. And that's the best way for you to stand out in this process. So we'll get into that. How can I hope to stand out when flawed, overworked people are in charge of making these decisions? One is put yourself in the admissions officer's shoes. And for me, that really means remember what they're going through to read your application. Remember how quickly they're going to be reading your application. Remember how many other applications that are similar to yours that they're going to be reading, and see if you can make their job easier, right? So one thing is, don't send unnecessary materials, right? If the school's not asking for a resume, don't send a resume. If they're only asking for 2 recommendations, send 2 recommendations. The only time we advise to send more or write anything in additional information is if it is really something that doesn't fit anywhere else in your application. It's something that's very important and crucial to them understanding who you are. And it's adding dimension that is not already covered in your application, right? So think about that. Have some sympathy for your admissions officer, even though that's not normally how we think about them, but they're really drowning under this pile of applications. And if you can make their job easier by being genuine and strategic, which we'll talk about in a second, and not submitting unnecessary materials, or, not overworking them in ways that, calling to ask questions that are clearly answered on the website, things like that, that's going to be appreciated, and they're going to notice your application, right? So the rest of this presentation will really be about kind of being genuine and strategic, and of course, I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I think that those 2 words really capture everything you need to do in this application process. Genuine is probably the hardest one, You know, I think a lot of people think strategic is the hard one. Like, what are they thinking? What's the competition like? It's really easy to get caught up in that. But if you focus on being genuine, genuine to your interests, genuine to your voice, genuine to a college that fits with you and what you're really looking for out of your college experience, that's going to take you through the admissions process in a really, really streamlined, smooth, hopefully stress-free way, or less stress, let's say, way. All right, let's get into it. So being genuine. This process is a time for self-reflection. And this means obsessing about fit, which I bet you could have guessed I would say. It's really important that you know the schools that you're applying to and that you understand how you're a fit. And if you're not a fit, that you are honest with yourself about that, right? You need to be yourself, not what you think someone else wants you to be, right? If you are honest about who you are and what you want out of your college application, you're in the best possible position for your application. So this is a very simplistic sort of metaphor, but I often compare the college application process to a dating game, or just the dating process in general. And the idea is you don't want to, pretend you're someone you're not, because then you're going to end up with someone that you're not actually compatible with. You also don't want to, chase after people who are not interested in you at all, or, the type of person you are at all, because that will be a big waste of your time and you're just setting yourself up for disappointment, right? So it's really important to think about that academic fit, which is a really key piece of this puzzle. Do you have the intellectual skills, the discipline, the experience to be able to succeed at a school that is very, very rigorous and very, very competitive? Or are you the type of person who would prefer maybe a block schedule or a place that has an open curriculum, right? Where is it that you actually fit your preferences and your strengths? Because if you can be really clear about what those are, the college is going to have an easier time understanding who you are and how you fit in their school. And then this turns into not a dating game, but rather you giving your admissions officer material for them to advocate for you with. Right? When they read your application, they're going to, they'll come up with their own sort of assessment of whether you're a fit or not. And if they think you are a fit, they're going to take your application into the decision committee and say, Johnny here deserves a spot at our school, and this is why. And you have to give them the ammunition there, right? And you're not really going to be able to do that unless you're being really honest with yourself and you're sure that the school is a good fit. So it's also important, I think, to be genuine, because admissions officers read so many of these applications that they can tell very quickly who's being genuine and who is not. Who is saying, yeah, I really want to go to your school, but actually you have no interest in going to their school. And that enthusiasm and, authentic interest shows in a lot of different ways, certainly in lots of places on your application, but also in the way you demonstrate your interest. So there are things like, right now, because it's COVID, you're going to do virtual tours and info sessions, maybe requesting an informational interview. If your school has a relationship with any of these colleges, the admissions counselor for your school may actually be hosting some sort of event that only your school students are invited to. If you go to those things, that's important. It could even be signing up for their newsletter or requesting information from their website, following them on Facebook or Twitter. All of those things get tracked and can indicate to them that you're very interested in the school. So those are also things to consider. Okay, now be strategic. Not in what you do, right? There's no recipe for becoming the best candidate that's going to get into every school. That just doesn't exist, right? But you've got to be strategic in how you present yourself. So admissions officers really respond to storytelling, and people in general respond to storytelling. I could list off a bunch of facts for you, but it would be much more interesting. I probably should have done that for this presentation, to take you through a story of somebody going through this process, right? You would remember it, you would identify with it in various ways. It would land differently. And it's the same thing in the application process, right? They really want to hear your story. And there are a lot of different ways to tell that story, and the application process provides a lot of different avenues to tell that story. So it's not all in the essays. It's not all in the teacher recommendations. It's not all in the activity list or resume, right? But there are various pieces that get told in those places. And it's very important to tell the right part of the story in the right place, right? So that's another thing to consider. I like telling students to think about a movie trailer or a movie review that they might have read. It's not necessarily a spoiler. It's not telling you everything about that movie, but it's getting you interested enough that you are convinced, yeah, I want to invest money or time watching this movie and getting to know this story and seeing it through to the end, right? And that metaphor of a movie trailer or even the opening scene of a movie, how you're convinced to not switch to something else on Netflix after the first 10 minutes, I think really lands with students, and can be very instructive in helping them construct their essay as well. So that's one that I really like. And at the end of the day, it's about building this personal narrative, not what specific story am I going to tell them from 11th grade, but rather the story of who the student is, what their values are, where they're going, all of those sorts of things, right? And there's one sort of overall narrative that all of these pieces of the application should participate in and tell the right piece in each of those places, right? And one thing that can be helpful is to think about, after much self-reflection, to think about how you want an admissions officer to describe you in one sentence, right? Oh, this is the kid who, his parents own a pig farm in Iowa, and he's really interested in science, so he's done all this genetic research on the pigs, right? That's a true story, okay? This is a student of mine who actually was able to get a hold of the admissions notes on his files. He was admitted to Harvard, and this is how they're referring to him. And that's a story that we told I should say he told, I helped him tell, in his essays, in his activity list, in a research supplement that he submitted, and his teachers all knew about it as well. So the story was very clear and came across in all of those different places. So think about your one-liner. And it may take a while to figure out what that is, right? And remember, it should be something that only you can say about yourself, right? Not a story that could apply to, you know, any kid in your school or anyone from your community or your background, right? It should be unique. So how does each part of the application fit into the story that you want to tell? That's the key question of what's the story, and then where do we show it? Where do we demonstrate it? So I'm going to take you through the basic parts of the application now and talk a little bit about that. So the application form itself, this is sort of the not thinky part where you just fill in your name and contact information, your school information, things like that. It covers all the basics. It is still very important. There's not much to be strategic about here. And there are no right or wrong answers. They want to understand your context. So they need to understand where you grew up, if you lived outside the country, what kind of education your parents have. Do you have any siblings, older, younger? Have they been through the college process yet? And they're trying to understand what resources you have to navigate this process, and how college ready you might be, or whether you're a first generation college student, which is also fine. But they're really trying to understand, okay, you know, they're going to look at this record of your achievement. What was the context that you achieved that in? Did you have to overcome, you know, significant obstacles? Or are you from a place where, you know, everybody and their mother goes to an Ivy League school because that's just part of the college going culture there, right? And that doesn't mean you're going to be disadvantaged if you come from a privileged background. It's just about having them understand the context that you're actually coming from. So it's really important to be as honest as possible here. There's really no gaming the system. So it's just some, you know, demographic information, basically. And the next part is the academic information. So this is a transcript and test scores if those are required. This is usually the most straightforward part. It won't always get you in, but it can keep you out. Colleges across the country for the last, I don't know how many years they've been doing this survey, but for a very long time have prioritized the academic information as the most important part of the application. This is the thing that most of their decision is based on, because they are trying to figure out if the student can succeed at their college. So the most important factors then are the overall GPA, the grades in the most advanced courses, the rigor overall of the course load. Is this a student who's getting A's in the easiest classes, or are they getting, B pluses and A minuses in the absolute hardest classes, right? There's a difference there. And the test scores, we can argue how much they actually measure. They tend to be correlated to socioeconomic background more than anything else. But many schools still use test scores to get a proxy for academic ability. And they have enough information from past applicants and past students to know what kind of grades, what kind of courses, and what kind of test scores predict the most success at their school, right? So most competitive schools will have an academic threshold. They're looking to see you have a, GPA of this range or higher, or they want to see certain types of advanced classes because that's a real good indicator for them that you'll be successful. But some schools don't. And again, it's not really a cutoff score in most places either. It's not you have to get this score and then you'll be fine. This is very, very important. And with COVID, I want to discuss this a little bit. A lot of schools are going test optional. I would say 95% of schools were test optional this past year for this year's seniors. Already, many schools are announcing test optional policies continuing into next year. So for next year's senior applying to college, they can choose to submit or not submit test scores. And this can lead to, some kind of analysis paralysis of, do we take them? Do we not take them? What does college really mean? Colleges have said students will not be disadvantaged if they can't submit test scores. But if they're not disadvantaged, are they not then advantaged for submitting test scores? It's a little confusing to understand how they're using this material. I want to believe that they're collecting test scores wherever they're available to sort of validate some of their decisions. But I would imagine in order to keep things fair, they wouldn't be able to use them as much as they've used them in the past, but really remains to be seen. We don't have a lot of clarity on this. We only have the early decision and early action results so far from this year's seniors. After March, I think we'll have a lot more information about how colleges went through this process and what does that mean for test scores. But if students are in a place where they have the time to prep for tests, time to focus on that, that's not going to distract from extracurriculars or leadership or their school grades. I generally think it's a good backup plan to think about, what do you need to do for testing? All right, I got a little bit off track there, but I do want to emphasize that most schools, most selective schools use what's called a holistic admissions process. So they're not going to weight everything the same for every single student. They really want to let the student's strengths be their strengths. So if a student doesn't have a great academic record, but they have amazing leadership and extracurriculars, their extracurriculars are going to hold more weight. This year in particular, the teacher recommendations and the academic grades mean a lot more than test scores because so many students were not able to take tests. So the sort of focus of what they're basing their evaluation on could shift from year to year and from student to student. So it's just important that students are putting their best foot forward in all of these areas wherever they can. I'm gonna stop rambling about that now. We'll go on to the activities list. The activities list, even though it's just like one page of the application and on the Common App only allows for 10 entries, it's one of the most important parts of the application because it really demonstrates the students' interests and their passions. And that's really key. Once they know that a student can make it at their school academically, they want to know, is this an interesting enough person to invite to our school? And this is where they figure that out, right? Students can communicate the breadth and depth of their extracurricular commitments, and admissions officers can really read between the lines here. So you don't need to list every single award, nothing from before ninth grade, and even if you do, let's say 15 really meaningful activities, this is a place where you really need to decide what are the 10 most meaningful to you, the 10 most important to you, because it really reflects on who you are and the kinds of things that you like to do. For example, that my student who got into Harvard with this pig farming story, his academics were amazing and almost a perfect score on the ACT, but that's not how they remembered him. It's not, oh, there's the kid with the perfect score on the ACT. It's the pig farmer kid. And that was only in his, extracurriculars. And then he wrote one of his shorter essays around it too. So this is where the character can really come out. It's important for students to know that they can be creative here. It feels a little like a resume. You only have 150 characters to describe each of the activities. But this is a place where, really strongly written, well-crafted phrases can do very important things for a student. They can demonstrate enthusiasm, the sophistication of their interest and things like that. Here's a place also where a lot of people are like, I'm just going to submit a resume. Do I really have to fill out this section? Yes, you do. No one wants to read a resume in a million different formats. This is the way they get that information standardized. And it includes questions about, the basics. What kind of club or organization or institution, if it was a job or something like that, what kind of activity was this? What's the name of it? What's your position there? What are your responsibilities? How many hours per week and week per year do you commit to this activity? And is this something you're interested in pursuing in college, which is one of the more important things that they're looking at here too, because they want to invite students to their school that are going to make it an interesting and better place for other students. So if, your student is one who started a club or began a movement to improve something for the student body, that is really going to reflect well on them, because it indicates that they might do that sort of thing on this campus when they get there as well. Last point. You don't only have to list school activities here. There are ways to list your hobbies if they're really significant, family responsibilities, right? If the student has responsibilities to care for a younger sibling or maybe an older relative, and that takes up a lot of their free time. That's something that should be listed here as well, because really they're trying to get a picture of what the student does outside of school. And that may be academically related or related to school clubs, but it might not be either. All right, then we get to the essays. These are very important, but not in the way that a lot of students think. You're not trying to tell your whole life story. You're really just trying to give them sort of a slice of your life, right? That movie trailer or the opening scene of a movie that introduces you to a character and makes them compelling to you, makes you care about them, right? That's what you're trying to do here. They also don't want to read a research proposal or a laundry list of your activities or really anything else that they can see otherwise in your application. So you don't need to talk about the classes you've taken or your accomplishments or your awards. Those are listed, right? This is a place to speak to an admissions officer directly in your own voice, right? I often tell my students, everything in your application, except for the essays, is a number or a list, right? You've got a grade, you've got a list of schools, you've got, a list of classes, you've got an SAT score, right? This is the place where you can actually jump off the page and appear as a whole person to them instead of a bunch of statistics. Right? So they want to know who you are and why you've done the things that you've done. So this is a place to tell a story and reflect upon it, right? What does the story that you're telling, maybe there's a scene from, I don't know, a car wash that the student was doing to raise money for something or other, and it went horribly wrong. And we've got this little snippet of a story, but we need to understand, like, what are you trying to demonstrate with that story? Is there a leadership quality or some resilience or a problem-solving nature or just your creativity that you're trying to demonstrate with the story that you tell us? And what does that story and your role in that story, what does that say about how you view the world and your place in the world, right? So these are big questions for anybody, let alone a teenager who has probably not really thought about these questions before. So this is the place where having an idea of a process and a timeline can really be helpful. This is not an essay that you're going to write overnight or even in a weekend. This is something that requires a lot of soul searching. It can be helpful to talk to somebody, some sort of mentor about this, whether it's a writing coach, a older relative, a teacher. Sometimes grandparents can be really helpful here. Grandparents, of course, always have the most wonderful thing to say about their grandchildren. And the way that they think about their grandchildren can often help a student think about, oh yeah, that is how the world sees me, or that is how I want the world to see me. So let me tell this story, right? So it's a very reflective, introspective process. And that's for the main college essay. So on the common application, that's 650 words, which both seems too long and too short. A lot of students are like, how am I going to fill that space? And then once we get writing, they've got, 1,700 words, and we've got to figure out how to cut it down. But there is, an art to that. They really need to think about getting the story out first and making sure that reflection is there, that the core pieces of who they are reflected in that story and what they're writing. And then we can find a way to kind of strategically cut it down. That's the main essay. Most colleges do also ask for what we call supplemental essays. And these are college-specific essays. You don't know what they are until you decide to apply to a college. And sometimes it's one longer essay, sometimes it's 3 shorter essays. A school like Yale has the whole range of things. There's a couple of really short ones that you have to answer in 25 words or less. Then there's some that are 50 words. Then there's like a longer essay. Most of them revolve around why do you want to go to this school? Why are you interested in what you indicated you want to study? Sometimes they're a little bit off the wall. Like UChicago is sort of famous for their supplemental essays. I remember I was working with a student who was applying there, and the question he decided to answer was, there is a place between dream and sleep, describe it. Which for me, that's not an essay I want to write, but he loved writing that essay. And so those college specific essays can also really tell you something about how well you fit with the school, right? The things that they're interested in learning about you. If you're interested in talking about them, that means it's probably a really good fit. But if you have to force it, maybe think again about that school. All right, so those are the kinds of essays you have to write, and they are very, very important pieces of the application process, and usually the thing that take the most time. Then we have recommendation letters. Now, a lot of my admissions officers on our team like to say this is really where it comes alive, because a student can say all sorts of great things about themselves, but it's not exactly objective, right? You're really marketing yourself at that point. But where a teacher comes in, that's where we can really start to see who the student is in the classroom, how they interact with other people. A student doesn't really have control of this narrative, so we can assume that this is a little bit more of an objective portrayal of who this student is and what this teacher thinks the abilities are. So these are extremely important, especially in the COVID era, where there may have been pass-fail grades for a semester. Remote learning is really messing everything up. There may not be test scores. There may not be extracurriculars, but teachers are still interacting with students, hopefully. This is a really important place. Students, as I said, don't have a lot of control over the content, but there are ways to set themselves up for success in the way that they ask for the recommendation and in the way that they build their relationships with the students, right? So you should choose teachers. I usually recommend students choose junior year teachers towards the end of their junior year and ask before the summer is out, before they commit to writing all sorts of letters for other people too. Students should really pay attention to their relationship with those teachers. And those teachers should be aware of the narrative, right? That one-liner, the overall narrative that you're trying to show in your applications, but also your just genuine interests, who you are outside of the classroom, things like that. So you've really got to pick teachers who know you well. And these would be teachers, not necessarily that gave the student the best grades. It could be a teacher who really witnessed how hard a student had to work to get a certain grade, and how engaged that student was in learning, even though it was a challenge for them. Those can be some of the best letters. But generally, these should be teachers who interact with students both inside and outside of the classroom, and even teachers who have been like an advisor for a club that the student is part of. That can be a really great angle to take. So I mentioned earlier, you don't want to send additional materials that aren't requested. Some colleges do allow students to submit additional recommendations. So typically it's 2 recommendation letters from 2 different teachers. Depending on what you think you might want to study, you can be strategic about, is it a math teacher, is it a science teacher, is it a humanities teacher, etc. But the other recommendations could come from a coach, a club advisor, a religious leader, a mentor of some sort, maybe a boss from a part-time job. But you should really only submit those additional letters if you can be sure they're going to say something that the teachers definitely did not say. Because if it's another letter that just says the same thing about the student, your admissions officer is going to be a little annoyed that they had to spend extra time reading something that didn't actually add anything to your profile. So keep that in mind. You want to balance the materials you send with the substantiveness of what's in them. All right, so that's really it. Those are the pieces of the application. And I'm sure a lot of you are saying, wait, that's it? It feels like such a all-encompassing, year-long, stressful process. How can we just reduce it to, five things? And that's what it really is. Just to recap our takeaways, remember that the admissions officers are people, and they're busy. And you need to differentiate yourself and make sure that you can show that you're fit. In order to stand out, you need to be genuine to yourself and strategic about how you communicate your narrative. And that 1-sentence summary can be really, really important. And you need to make sure that every piece of your application really supports that. And if you believe in it, if it's genuine and you believe in it, that will really come through in every piece of this application. And that's really going to be your key to success. So that's our presentation. I am going to stop screen sharing, but there's my information. If you don't already have it, Sheila@signeteducation.com, phone number, give us a call, send me an email. I'm always happy to answer any of your questions, but let's take your questions now.
You guys can feel free to ask your questions in the chat, or if you'd like to come off mute, if that's easier, you can also do that as well. That was such an excellent presentation, Sheila.
Thank you, Savannah. I always love this moment before people feel like the confidence to ask questions, because it's like, oh, I just answered everybody's question. I did such a good job. I'm sure that's not the case. Please ask any questions you have.
Hi, Sheila. This is Livia.
Hi, Livia.
Hi. That was a really nice presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question about community service in the time of COVID.
Yes.
It's been so hard for kids to find a safe way to contribute to the larger community. What is I don't know if you have any sense of how colleges are feeling about that particular aspect of the application. That'd be helpful. Thank you.
That's a great question. And I think it depends sort of student by student. I think colleges are going to want to take the context into account, right? So if they understand that this is a student whose family may not have been financially impacted, let's say, by COVID. And there is a COVID question on the application too, where students can talk about these things. But if this is a student whose family has not been financially impacted and they don't have, extra family obligations, if it's likely that they have, their own laptop and a stable Wi-Fi connection and their own room and a place to keep up with their academics, I think that colleges would be pleased to see students going out of their way to give back, right, to their community. But if this is a situation where a student all of a sudden, you know, a younger sister or something is no longer in daycare and it's their responsibility to help out with that, I would expect, number one, a student to demonstrate that somehow in their application. But then also, I don't think there would be that much more expected of them, right? And certainly no college wants to see a student put themselves at risk. So this doesn't mean students need to go and volunteer in clinics or food banks or, you know, any of those things. If they are at risk, or if a family member is at risk, they would put them at risk by doing that. But there are a lot of digital volunteer opportunities and ways to help. So I know a lot of students have just been FaceTiming with people who are in nursing homes, who are extremely isolated and have been for the last year. And just a 20-minute FaceTime once a week can be so meaningful for those people. And it's a really great growth experience for a student, right? So we may not always think about something like that as community service, but it really is, right? What we're looking for is community engagement and finding a way to stay involved. I know that there are a lot of institutions that are looking for digital volunteers. And even when there aren't clear opportunities, a lot of students are creating their own opportunities, right? They've banded together with other students to start a tutoring service, or fundraise, or make masks, or, you know, what have you. So I think that it's not a must, but I think if it is possible, students should really double down on their community service. And again, you know, I hate telling people you should really do this because it's going to look good on your college applications, right? That's not going to serve you in the end, right? And it's not authentic in that way. But if there is an interest that a student has that could be spread to other people, or, you know, students who might be interested in something like that. So I'll give you an example. One of my students is very interested in debate, and he is trying to put together some sort of debate tournament that is coupled with teaching sort of underprivileged students. He lives in a foreign country and there's a refugee camp nearby where he lives. So he's going to try to arrange for virtual debate coaching for some of these students in the refugee camps. And the, you know, money he's going to raise by putting on this tournament is going to, you know, directly go to this refugee camp, but then he's also giving back through, you know, coaching these younger students. So that's an opportunity he created for himself. And you know, he's going to need a little help kind of coordinating everything, but he's going to be able to get corporate sponsorship. It's not going to cost him money. And it's sort of a win-win for a lot of different people. So I'm not saying everybody needs to do something at that scale, but I think every student can reflect and think about, okay, do I have the ability to help? What are my interests and how can those help other people? And how can we find that sort of beautiful overlap of my interests and helping other people for a good reason, right? And that way it's more genuine, the student's actually learning something and, you know, doing something with their actual interests, but it's also helping other people. I hope that helps.
Yes, that does. Thanks so much, Sheila.
Hi, Sheila. This is Sylvia.
Hey, Sylvia.
Thank you so much. It was really a very good presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So my question is similar to the one before, but related to teachers and writing letters of recommendations. Mm-hmm. When I talk to my daughter, she says very clearly that they don't know each other very well now.
Yeah.
You know, they have, you know, many times, many teachers are only on Zoom. They don't come to school for family reasons. So that there is no personal interaction and it's always behind the screen.
Yeah.
And I guess it can be very difficult for teachers to have a sense of who the student is, also because they don't watch them interact between each other. Mm-hmm. They don't see interacting with their peers. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, I suppose it must be a tough job for teachers as well.
Yeah, I think it's hard all around. But yes, this is a challenge that we've been thinking about a lot. And one of the things I mentioned, I didn't go into detail about it, so I'm glad you asked this question. But one of the things I mentioned when we talked about recommendations was asking in a certain way that would help the student kind of feel confident that a certain message is going to be incorporated in their recommendation. So what I always recommend students do is put together a package, right? And some schools call this like a brag sheet. For me, I like just using the activity list that they're going to submit with their college applications, maybe a draft of their essay if they've got some ideas already, kind of a picture of a vision of themselves in the future, right? And the way to ask is, especially now with limited interactions between teachers and students, they're not seeing them in the hallway. There's not, vibrant discussions in the classroom where they can really witness how that student interacts with other people. Really, the student kind of needs to go out of their way to build that relationship, but it also needs to be in some sort of authentic way, right? So let's say your daughter is going to ask for a recommendation from her history teacher. If there's something they're learning that is related to something else your daughter is interested in, maybe your daughter can say, oh, I read this article and it made me think of what we were learning, and email the teacher. And by the way, do you have, 15 minutes to talk one-on-one? I'm starting my college process and I would really love to get your input on, some of the things that I'm working on. And then in that meeting, the student can then say, I've learned X, Y, and Z in your class. It's been inspiring in all these ways, something really true to their experience in the class, even though it's been remote, blah, 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 whatever you're going to say, and say, I would love if you could write me a recommendation. I recognize, this year is different and you don't have a chance to interact with me, but I would love to, have the opportunity to tell you more about my interests and things like that. So, it might not feel as authentic as a relationship that develops over time from being in the same place, but it's explicit and gives the student a chance to actually say, I really want to develop this relationship with you. And then, ask the teacher if they would be willing to write a recommendation. And if so, I've got all this material prepared for you. I want to make this easier for you, right? And that way you provide the brag sheet, the vision, the, why I want to go to this college or that college, what I hope to do with my life, that sort of thing. You'll find that, a lot of teachers kind of use a form letter for their recommendations, but they do try to put in a couple of anecdotes about each student. Right. And I know when teachers are writing these recommendations, they're often racking their brains. Like, what do I say about this student? I don't really know. I've written so many of these, but then they can turn to the brag sheet or the little paragraph that the student has written, or maybe the draft of their essay, and pull something from there. Right? So you're not forcing a teacher to write something. You're just sort of gently nudging them and saying, oh, here, wouldn't it be easy if you just use some of this material? But, this is a really delicate process. And I can imagine a lot of students not doing it very tactfully and teachers feeling very pressured. So I think it's really important to really think through each piece of that process. And sometimes it's not all in one call. It might just be, I would love a time to, talk with you more about my interests. And then they set up a call for the next month or maybe the month after, a recurring thing. And then, towards the end of the year, you actually ask for the recommendation once the relationship has been built a little bit more. And there's no guarantee that's going to work. Some teachers are really not interested in spending more time than they have to on Zoom. So at the end of the day, you've got to go with what you're going to get. But I do think colleges will also have that in mind, particularly for, this year's juniors, next year's seniors, who will have had a full year of remote learning in their more, the most advanced classes they've had up until that point. So I think that they will kind of take those with a grain of salt if the teacher really doesn't know anything about the student.
Thank you. This was very helpful.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, Sheila, this is Zoran calling. I have a question if we still have time.
Of course, go ahead.
I guess I'm curious just overall, given the pandemic and given how that has completely altered the academic experience of the current high school students, how do admissions offices reflect upon that in terms of their expectations for overall activities? I know you touched upon some of the sort of social oriented activities, but just overall in terms of academics, activities, other experiences and such.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it again depends on every college and depends on every school. So some schools have taken to moving a lot of their extracurriculars online. And I know a lot of places are still having sports and things like that, which kind of blows my mind, but it's still happening at some schools. So some extracurriculars are moving forward in a somewhat normal way, but a lot of them are just completely canceled. Right. So this is a place where, there's a COVID-19 question, which is basically, how has COVID-19 impacted your life? And this is a place where students can talk about, well, I was supposed to do this thing, but it got canceled. I really love this activity, but is inherently an in-person activity and we had to stop. And I filled my time with this other thing, right? So explaining that I think is really important if certain opportunities have become impossible because of COVID. But this is also a place where the school can do a lot. So in addition to those 2 teacher recommendations, the counselor generally sends a letter along with the student's grades. And that's a place where a counselor can talk about extenuating circumstances that everyone in the school has had to face. The schools also have a school profile that they share with the colleges. And this is like a pretty simple document that explains their grading system, the typical progression of classes, the college going population at their school, and any key features that they feel a college should know about the education at that school. And that's a place where particularly next year, I think, and this year it happened a little bit too, that's a place where college counselors are saying, we canceled all of our extracurriculars, or everybody went pass fail, and really explaining how they handled grades and activities during that time. So you can hope at least that there is some context being given there, but there are places in the application that you can also explain those things. One of the things that we learned from colleges this fall is that if a student was supposed to be in an activity in 12th grade, but it was canceled from COVID, they can still mark that it was an activity for 12th grade. Right? But they just need to indicate it was, canceled or limited because of COVID. So I think that's a sign that colleges are really trying to be understanding here. And this in particular is not something that they are not used to dealing with, right? So in the United States, we push our students to do tons of extracurriculars and all sorts of stuff outside of school. In other countries, they don't. Many schools don't have sports teams or academic clubs or, students against drunk driving or student government or any of those things, right? Some schools do, but many of them don't in foreign countries. And so those students come in and, we work with them as well. A lot of them are worried, well, I don't do all this volunteer work. We don't have an NHS. We don't have this or that. But that's, again, where the context comes in. So colleges are well aware that that's not part of the educational emphasis in those parts of the world. And so it'll be, I think, a similar thing with schools that don't have extracurriculars this year.
Thank you. Very helpful.
Okay.
All right, we have about 3 minutes left in our time, so we're coming up. If there is a fast question, we can do it, but if not, we have Sheila's email address, but I'm also going to put it in the chat as well. And would love to answer any other questions that might come to mind offline after this as well.
Great. Well, Savannah, thank you for hosting. Everyone, thank you for joining. I always enjoy this, and I hope I get to talk to you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
All right.
Thank you,
take care.
Sheila.